I wanted to say that we're very fortunate to have Charlie with us today. Uh, he's a New Yorker and went to the Brooklyn Polytechnic and graduated in '74, came directly to Langley, worked in thermal structures, which I was part of the structures group too. I knew him back then, and I think it was on the editorial committee where he had a very good paper. Uh, the, at the bottom, I'm kind of just cheating and reading here. He has 7 patents. While at Langley, he went to George Washington University for a master's, and all of this is aerospace engineering, Virginia Tech and aerospace engineering for his PhD. Then it was a surprise to us instructors. He decided, hey, I think my research job, it's interesting, but maybe flying the shuttle would be something I should try. So in '96, he went out to Johnson Space Center and was on the return to flight mission after Columbia. Very exciting. There's a lot of things you can read about that. Then he was, after his shuttle missions, he was at the office of chief engineer. Basically, he was one of the people that made high-level decisions in engineering at Langley, and then he went on to do it at Johnson and then at headquarters before he retired in 2019. So if you look at '74 and 2019, he had 45 years at NASA, which is quite admirable. He still does some teaching at New York, NYU. Can you still hear me? I have a beep. Anyway, yeah, it must be an incoming call. Okay, then we traditionally have fun facts to show that, you know, people that we have are very distinguished, they're normal people too. So there is a fun fact. In fact, you can go out to YouTube and there's something called Funny Astronauts. Well, they're astronauts that talk to other astronauts and share everything. And they invited Charlie a couple of times, and you can really see what he's like and how humorous he is when he gets together with the other astronauts and they talk about all the things that were in the background. So anyway, one of the incidents that kind of stands out is when he was being selected, they had boards they had to go through, and one of them had a couple psychologists, psychiatrists, and he had to convince them that, you know, he was suitable for going to flight. And one of the questions they asked all the astronauts was, have you ever had a life-threatening situation where you recovered from it? And he did, and he had many of them. And so basically, he went back to where he was in New York and was going to a restaurant. And I guess that's the way I can introduce Charlie and say that, you know, he survived basically the lump and people trying to kill him. So Charlie, maybe you can carry it on from there.
Thanks, Olaf. That was a great introduction. And yeah, if you wanna hear the whole story, you go to Two Funny Astronauts by good buddy Mike Massimino, Garrett Reisman. Have it on YouTube. It's part 2. And I tell the story. And what surprised the hell out of me was after they listened to all the near-death experiences from all the test pilots, I shocked the hell out of the psychiatrist, and I really didn't think I was going to get selected. But anyway, I'm always glad to come back to Langley. And so I really want to give this presentation to you guys, especially guys my age and older, that NASA used to be like. I wrote this book. It's taken me about 18 years to write it. The first half of the book, if you don't know me, you think I hate NASA, or you think I have sour grapes because I was fired from my director of engineering job. And those two statements are furthest from the truth. I love NASA. That's why I stayed here so long. And I really didn't want the director of engineering job. Mike Griffin wanted me to do that. And so what I learned through this experience, what I'm looking at NASA now, is the first half of this book tells a story about how bad NASA has come and why we've gotten here. and how bad the culture is. And you see it happen in a lot of other industries like Boeing right now. When the culture is bad, bad things happen. You get these recurring accidents. And so I have to get into some really ugly details about how bad NASA has gotten in order to lead up to the second half of the book, which is really how do we fix this problem? And that's why I'm here. Because I tossed these ideas out of things that we tried. Some of the people in this room working with me while I was back here at Langwood trying to help transform NASA, and we weren't successful. But anyway, so the first title of this book was Houston, you've got a problem, but my publisher said that that's already been taken. So the name of the book is Mission Out of Control, and it's going to be coming out in November. So jump online and pre-order this book. So I'll become famous. Uh-oh, this thing is working. There we go. So there we go. So I'm an old guy. So when I was about 6, 7 years old, this is what I wanted to be, an astronaut, all right? I love science. I loved engineering. And so I got my dream job. I got to come and work for NASA. And I got to work at the best NASA center out there, NASA Langley Research Center, the Mother Center. And I spent 22 years here having the time of my life in the thermal structures branch, doing thermal structures research with some amazing people like Steve Scotty and some of you folks, and really loved what I was doing. But what happened was in 1996, NASA was not the same. We had really not getting any money into research. Applied research was going down the tubes. I didn't like the way NASA was going. I said, you know what, I'm going to do a career change. I claustrophobic, can't swim, and afraid of heights. I think I'm going to go after my childhood dream and become an astronaut. Okay. I was training in Russia. Well, and I'm going to talk about the Columbia tragedy, right? I lost 7 friends, 3 classmates. I was training in Russia, right? And so we have some great trainers. This trainer wasn't the greatest trainer out there. You can tell by the look on my face. I was training in Russia when the accident happened, right? And one of the astronauts came across the commons at the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center. Put this on TV. Very sad. When I saw this used piece of foam come off and hit this vehicle, and nobody told me about it. I'm seeing this for the first time, and nobody thought this was coming. I was enraged. I wanted to go home immediately. Wasn't allowed to go home, right? When the people on the ground saw that piece of foam come off, they made a very bad decision, right? And this is what happened. We lost the crew. So if you want to understand what causes accidents, you have to read Diane Vaughn's book, The Challenge of Law's Decision. But you need to read it like I did, because when I saw that happen, first thing I did in Russia, I called up people at the thermal structures branch from Russia, woke them up, and it said, get all the data from the tile test that we were doing. And it was, who the hell is this guy? Is this guy crazy? I was trying to solve the problem, the technical problem. But what the real problem was the culture. This woman is amazing. She spent 10 years of her life studying this so that when the Columbia happened, Admiral Gaiman made the connection. He said, you have to listen to Diane Vaughn, because in her book, she points out exactly how these causes, these cultural causes, caused the Columbia accident. This is another very good book. But you have to study the culture to understand it in order to be able to change it. Most organizations are never able to change their culture. NASA can't, Boeing is trying, and they're not going to be able to. The other thing I realized was that when we look at what caused the Challenger accident, right, we all think it's the O-rings, but it wasn't the O-rings, right? It was actually the field joint, right? We all understand that. And so when they solved that problem, the solution was going back to Langley and other people that did the right nonlinear structural analysis to come up with the new joint design. We knew that was a problem. When you go back and you look, they were using an outdated, a very crude model to understand what was happening at that joint, to flow through that joint. It was an empirical kind of relationship, was not physics based. They did not understand the root cause of that problem. Okay? But that's what researchers do, right? But Diane Vaughan, this is the first time in history that culture was cited as the main cause of an accident. Okay? People on the ground, the model they used was called the crater model, right? People on the ground looking at this model to determine impact. It's a curve fit of 50 points, very small pieces of foam, right? 2.1 to 3 inches cubed, only 50 data points, a lot of scatter. What did they do? They curve fit that line, has no relationship to the physics of the problem, and they use that to predict a 400 times larger size piece of foam impacting the vehicle at 545 miles an hour. And nobody, not one of the managers, not one of the engineers asked the question, how the hell can you do that with that kind of understanding of the problem? It's not physics based. And for the life of me, I can't understand how this could happen, right? That we had managers that had engineering degrees that had somehow risen through the ranks, and some of them were even chief engineers. And someone said, we don't think it's going to be a problem because this is the analysis that we use. And I'm thinking, nobody in their right mind at NASA Langley Research Center, they would have been jumping up and down saying, no, you can't do that. It's a totally different culture. What I realized was, well, this is the cast of characters. We all know the story. Rodney Rocha raised his hand and said we should take a picture. He was an engineer, and people shot him down. Paul Shack shot him down. He said, I'm not going to bring it forward because I don't want to be called a chicken little. Linda Hampson was the mission management team lead. She said, there's nothing we could do anyway. Cal Schoenberg was supposed to be a shuttle tile expert that said there's no way there was going to be a problem with that wing leading edge, that that huge piece of foam. Mike Gordon was the RCC expert. Nobody weighed in. Nobody questioned it. Mike Gordon led the LESS PRT. It's the culture, stupid. So Diane Vaughan, basically culture, values, norms, beliefs, practices. It's what makes us do what we do at work. It's how we all get together, converse, communicate. It's our values, how we make decisions, what we base those decisions on. And culture, when you think about it, I hear NASA culture. There's no one NASA culture. When you read the history of NASA Langley, NASA Ames, NASA Glenn, you read those huge SPs, you realize that every NASA center is totally different. We knew that. Research centers is totally different than flight centers, right? And what we do. And then if you dig down within each center, you have subcultures. In the JSC, we had astronauts, we had MOD, we had engineering, totally different cultures. Individual working groups develop their own cultures. The O-Ring working group, the leading edge structural subsystem problem resolution team working group develop their own cultures, right? You have to understand that. A good book to read about this, somebody that gets it, is Howard McCurdy wrote a book, Inside NASA, talks about it. I dove in to try to understand everything about behavioral science, organizational science, sociology, and I put together about 40 different terms that describe the different ways that people behave which cause these accidents, right? And when I first did it, when I first saw this, I basically said I could sum it up with one word: arrogance. People thought they knew what they didn't know, and they weren't good researchers and trained like researchers. And if you don't know something, the correct technical answer is, I don't know. Okay, that's how I was raised, right? I used to think that was the case. A big part of it is psychological safety, being able to say things that are dissenting opinions without fear of recrimination or reprisal, right? We're allowed to argue, right? But the data is what rules, right? And so what I realized was a lot of these terms are connected. But what I realized, what Diane Vaughan and some of the other people were missing, is the distinction between a scientist, an engineer, and what we do at NASA Langley. We were research engineers. I grew up in a research culture. And if you had that research culture, none of these things, right? So you look at when you research high reliability organizations, psychological safety. If you grew up where I grew up as a researcher, there would have been no problems. We wouldn't have had these accidents, right? And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about that research culture. Psychological Safety, a really good book by Diane Vaughan, is the Fearless Organization. Harvard Business Review. She writes a lot on this. Be able to engage in constructive criticism and conflict without fear of recrimination, right? Amy Rozovsky, when she was doing the Aristotle program, when she was trying to understand at Google which teams were successful, she couldn't make sense of it until she viewed it through the lens of psychological safety. That all the teams that were successful, that was the underpinning. We'll talk about that a little bit. So what's the research culture? So I had some of the most amazing people to work for at NASA Langley. Jim Starnes, Paul Cooper, Yarek Sobieski, the leaders in structural mechanics, aerothermodynamics, multidisciplinary optimization, right? Starnes had the most impact on me for the most. He was the first person I worked for as an intern. And he taught me what being a researcher was. And he said, Charlie, you have to have that thirst for knowledge. And I look at him and say, no, you don't understand that thirst. And he said, researchers, whether you're a scientist and you're looking at something in nature, or you're a structures person and you're looking at a new concept, try to understand how that's going to behave in the world. You come up with a mathematical representation or an analysis. You try to predict how it's going to behave. You go into the laboratory and you conduct an experiment, and the double-ended arrows, and you would go through this over and over again. The double-ended arrows are because you don't always get it right. And either you made a mistake in your analysis and your assumptions and your initial conditions, or you made a mistake in your experiment. But you vary the parameters and you test to failure. You have to test to failure because that's when you really understand the problem that you're trying to solve. Once you do that, then you can take that analysis, go to the world and do optimization, right? And dance around in design space and come up with a minimum mass design or a higher performing design. But then you still go back to your productive. This is what scientists, this is what researchers do. If the analysis isn't good enough, researchers dive into mathematics, the physics of the problem, and then create a better analysis. But researchers have that thirst for knowledge. When they see an anomaly, it drives them nuts. If your results don't correlate, you're always wondering why, right? And that's how I was. The other thing he taught me was you use a building block approach. Jennifer's principles, if you're looking at designing a full-scale cryogenic tank, you look at the material properties at the elemental level, the subsystem level, and you look for all the different ways your idea or that concept could fail, and you test until you build up to almost a full-scale structure, looking at combined loads, looking at joints, till you have the full-scale system, and you're constantly improving your analysis until you can predict what's going to happen. Testing the failure, understanding how that's going. What made NASA great, what made NACA great, because that's really where we got this research gene, okay? scientific method, building block approach, permission to try and try again. That's in the Langley SP on the history of NASA Langley. Permission to fail, I call it. We're allowed to go out there and try and learn. And we design our experiments to learn as much as we can from those experiments. Psychologically safe environment. Jim Starnes always had my back. I was always protected. I could speak my mind. Believe me, I would have been fired from a lot of organizations if it was anything but that. Flat organization, very informal when I first came to work here. Meritocracy, not a bureaucracy. You defer to the person, no matter what the hierarchical status of the organization, with the knowledge. The person with the knowledge rules, and that's a person who you listen to. It's not like that at the other NASA centers. Transparent, open sharing information. We write research reports, peer reviewed editorial process out here. We're craving people to criticize what we're doing because we want to make sure it's correct. And a short story, funny story, George Abbey, when he was coming here to interview me, and he was making fun of NASA Langley. He told me I have to leave that library and come work for a real organization. Well, that semi-interview with Hampton didn't go very well. And I'm still surprised to this day that I got selected, but they view us as if we're working in the sandbox. We're just a library until they need us, okay? Encourage the maturation of competing ideas. We would compete with our ideas in thermal protection system with the guys at Ames, for instance. But that's how you make sure we're doing the best that we can and we're really critiquing each other, right? So this was my branch that I loved, and I loved working there. I loved leading it. I loved handing it off to Steve Scotty. I call this a research of systems because we weren't just looking at panels. We weren't just looking at heat transfer and heat pipes. We were looking at a system, whether it was a thermal protection system, a cryogenic tank, or a hot structure. And we tested those things to failure so that we understood how they would fail, and we could predict how they could fail. A very good book I read as I was doing my research was Team of Teams by General Stanley McChrystal. And they described what he called the team of teams, that he had to develop a different way of fighting Al Qaeda in Iraq because they had to respond very quickly. They had to pass information very quickly. And it was really a network as opposed to this command structure, which is what NASA and most bureaucracies have become, where information is slow, it's not transparent, it's not passed properly, it's isolated, it's restricted. And when I saw that, it made me understand that my branch, our branch, the thermal structures branch, is really like that dashed line at NASA Langley and how we operated. So we had these systems and these subsystems, and we had people in that branch. You see, they're multicolored because they were multi-talented, like structures, aerothermal, they could do it, right? So we were cross pollinizing each other as we were working together to solve these problems and to innovate solutions to these problems. That taught me how to work on these small teams, how to build these teams with highly coupled. Well, the sun collapsing. Now I'm going to go over now. But anyway, so but the beauty of that in that network at Langley was if we didn't understand something, whether it was thin walled structures, buckling, we could walk across the street to thermal structures, to the structural mechanics branch, and go to the expert, right? And so we had these connections. Plus, we were connected to the great guys in the vehicle analysis branch. So we could basically look at what they could look at these great ideas for vehicles, and they could come to us and say, is this concept viable? Do we have the right constraints? Are we making the right assumptions? And we knew whatever changes we made, how it would affect the actual vehicle design. So we had multiple levels, the system, the subsystem, all the way to the vehicle side. And it was this network. It was very informal, and people shared information. And that's how come the early NACA folks, when they created NASA, And that DNA transferred to Johnson Space Center. Those young engineers like Max Paget, Chris Kraft, Bob Gilroy, when they went to Johnson Space Center, they knew how to run small projects. They knew if they didn't know the answer, where they could go to. That is what made Apollo successful, period. But then something bad happens. So in the book, I describe how did this get here, right? And it happens, it's like boiling the frog, it's the boiling frog, right? It happens gradually, right? We had this great organization called NACA, right? Totally research laboratory, small, informal, geeky guys doing vehicle research in aeronautics at higher and higher altitudes, faster and faster speeds at the edges of the atmosphere. And one of the Exodus teams actually flew into space. When it came time, when Sputnik happened, at that Sputnik moment, we basically formed a space task force from people from Langley and Glenn and basically transferred those people, basically start Johnson Space Center. The Army Ballistic Missile Agency had another culture that I talked about, the German culture, with Werner von Braun, that were very similar in how they did business, hands-on, understanding the details, super engineers, and went to Marshall Space Flight Center. And then together we had to merge with the Air Force and the systems management and systems engineering approaches, because the problems got so complex. Apollo got so complex, it was so large, spread out contractors all around the country, and we couldn't manage it all. We couldn't do everything in-house. We started to lose that research DNA as the years went on. As the dollars declined and the Space Center started fighting for that funding, they started taking money from the research side of that. Taking these huge man space programs. Okay. And that's what happens. And I talked a little bit about the life cycle of bureaucracies, right? What was amazing was when I went and was training as an astronaut, I found mistakes in structures and other areas that people were missing at Johnson Space Center. The treadmill that the astronauts were running on, the slats were breaking. And I was at Capcom, and I got into trouble for yelling at the contractor, office building. I said, show me stress analysis. It was one day, it was totally missed the loads by a factor of 3, used the wrong material properties, and it was very rudimentary beam theory. And I said, this is wrong. They under-designed those sets. It was sophomoric, and everyone in Johnson Space Flight Center who was ever monitoring that contract totally missed it, right? The cold plates were leaking in the lab module when I was out there as an astronaut. I said, well, give me a piece of that. Let me send that back to Langley. And Bill Winfrey basically told them how they could use the machines they had at Marshall Space Flight Center to detect the bad cold plates. So it was because I had that connection to Langley that I could do that. And that's what was missing. Foam coming off the external tank, we still haven't been able to solve that problem. And we'll talk about the heat shield on Orion later. So, another chapter in the book in the second half talks about how you build these high performing teams. And I wrote a whole chapter. I could have written an entire book on it because I researched it so much and I practiced it so much that there are lots of different factors that go into a team. Right. And every one of these factors, psychological safety, leadership style, cohesion, creativity, critical thinking, books have been written about pieces of those parts, right? And then you have many different types of teams. And depending on what team you need to develop to solve the problem you want, some of these factors are weighted in priority in what you need. For like a new design, you want it to be a team that's very creative in the conceptual design phase. But I don't want to go into that. But like I told you before, the key to all these teams is psychological safety. Right? That's linked to so many of these other aspects. But in order for you to have a psychologically safe organization, you have to have very strong leadership. from the top down, and it has to be enforced at all the different levels. And that's not being done. So the first thing we had to do was figure out what caused the accident. How did the foam cause the accident? And I remember Johnson Space Center had seen foam come off the vehicle since the first shuttle flight, but they never were able to figure out if it hits the vehicle, what kind of damage. They worked with Southwest Research Institute that used a hydrocode to predict impact of foam, but they ended up using that crater model, was all they had for 30 years. Right when I saw that, I said, this is crazy. And so I wanted to start a team to basically solve that problem. The people at Johnson Space Center, the engineers said, we can't do anything until the program tells us we need that. Right? I said, boom. I went to Langley, Del Freeman. I said, Del, I need Ed Fasanella. And then I went to Glenn and I went to Woodrow Whitlow and I said, I need Matt Mellis and that team. And they said, you can have them, Charlie. We put together a presentation to present to the people at Johnson Space Center, even though they told us we weren't allowed to, right? And this is the return to flight. We had about 2.5 years, right? But we started this team right after the accident, right? I went and I started that team, took these great people from different parts of the country, got them to work together, right? And of course, they wouldn't let me lead the team, right? They had to pick someone from Johnson Space Center to lead the team, but that didn't make a difference because these people were phenomenal. Ed Fasanella, 30 plus years, never the most humble person you'd ever want to meet, totally knew what the heck he was doing. Matt Mellis and his team at Glenn, very creative. They were using a small gun, little piece of foam into a chamber that could be in a vacuum, because we know at what altitude you got hit with this piece of foam, and it was a closed cell piece of foam. Plus, they were looking at advanced monitoring techniques, using photogrammetry, to get a full understanding of displacement after it gets hit. You know, when Dan Bell was an engineer at Boeing that was designing the full-scale test, I went to him and he told me that they don't need any analysis before they run the test, and they're only going to put 6 strain gauges on its full-scale weight test. And I said, wait a minute, Dan. I know people at Langley, we can do this. He said, no, I don't need your help. He said, no, I don't need. I met a gentleman named John Neer. He was the chief engineer at Lockheed Missiles and Space that was working on the cave with the cave as an observer. He convinced them to allow us to put this team together, right? And when we presented this team and Ralph Rose saw what we were doing, he said, wait a minute, we're going to put this person to lead that team. But they didn't need me. They did this all on their own. This is Langley Research Center and the folks here. We also hooked up with people at Boeing, Philadelphia, who were doing drop tests, very much like what we were doing here at Langley, understanding impact from drop tests and crash worthiness. So what did they do? Using that building block approach, started shooting small pieces of foam, failing smart, fast, small, cheap, early and often, comparing those results with the real experiment, linking it up with materials people in the organizations to understand the failure theories, to understand how it would fail. And then you move on to understanding the foam. Then you looked at small coupon specimens, once again, testing to failure, right? They built up this knowledge by rapidly failing, rapidly learning, just like good researchers do, so that before they ran that full-scale test, this is what they predicted, right? In 3 months, 3.5 months, they had that analysis down, right? So then you'll remember the full-scale test. And they wanted to do this without any instrumentation. Now we had full field cameras inside. It's running shoot a large piece of foam at 545 miles an hour. And Scott Pace out at Ames Research Center is out there jumping up and down saying, we found the smoking gun, we found the smoking gun. This would have been the dumbest, stupidest test if they only had 6 strain gauges on it. But because we had real solving this problem, it was a very informative test. This is how fast they were able to do that, right? This is the history in the cave report of foam loss, right? from space shuttle, from the very first space shuttle practically, right? Large pieces of bipod foam. These aren't small pieces. This is just a large piece of bipod foam, the kind that destroyed the vehicle and caused the Columbia accident. 3 months before Columbia, a large piece of bipod foam came off, hit the aft skirt of an SRB, and dented one of the metal fins, the structure. And nobody thought that was a problem at Johnson Space Center. Nobody said, let's slow up this program. Let's try to understand what happens if this was if it hits the orbiter, this was a failure of imagination. We could have had a team, basically with the right people, had this problem solved many years ago. But at least the people at Johnson Space Flight Center would have known the right people to call. When they saw that, they spoke to no one. They didn't call anyone except the one phone call that went out to someone about landing gear at Langley. And they probably got hell for it. The other thing we had to do was, now that we saw this large piece of foam and the damage that it would cause, how are we going to design a system to repair damage like that for the next crew that goes up, right? So this was the other team that we put together. I started out in Don Pettit's garage. Look how young you look, Dave Throckmorton over there. And Woodrow Whitlow. We went into his garage laboratory. We didn't tell anyone we were going there because the folks at JSC would have stopped us, the program manager, right? Believe it or not. And so we didn't do that, right? There we go. So, and we were allowed to try things and fail, smart, fast, small, cheap, early and often. We tried dozens of ideas in Don Pettit's garage. We found ways to drill and tap through the silicon carbide surface. We put together a small team, phase one in Don Pettit's garage. Then we transitioned to Steve Scotti ran a team here at Langley. And it was during this training session, this ideation session at Langley that we had come up with this idea for a doubly curved shell so that you didn't need thousands of them. You just needed 18 of them so that it would flatten out, it would deform, drill and tap a hole and put a carbon fastener through it, right? That was our idea. So we designed these drill bits specially to do the job. Know nothing about drill bits, but with the guys at Langley and Don Pettit's help, we created a tool and had it ready for me to fly in space. One of the things we learned, right, was that, well, these things aren't working for some reason. But anyway, we learned that the other patches that the other contractors were designing were burning up. At Langley, at that first meeting, Pete Knopfel solved this problem. He did the analysis overnight, and he said the reason why it's burning up, Charlie, is they have to be about less than 1/10 of an inch thick and less than a 6-degree bevel angle on that forward-facing ramp for the heating to be low enough so it wouldn't have a problem. And once we solved that problem, so connecting with the right expert, right, that network at the right time, bringing them into your team saves you that much time, right? And so this is video of us using that. Steve Scotti's team that he ran at Langley used this step-based design approach for rapid concept development. And what they were able to accomplish was they had a suite of ideas from very small damage to just using fasteners to patches and plugs. Steve and his team came up with a full-scale curved out panel that if we had to, in an emergency, we could actually solve that pizza box size hole. That's what you're able to do when you have the right team and the right people, and you're running like a real research organization. So I got to fly in space. Did NASA learn its lesson, right? When we were out there, pictures, when I could get really quickly, our crew was at Michoud. After the week, they took off the bipod ring, right? And so, you know, I know for sure we're not going to get hit with a bipod ram. So the people calculate the probability. So I know when I would believe we're not going to get it. But there was a huge power ring, the Dubrance airload ram. And Eileen looked at me and the rest of the crew and asked the folks at Michoud, Should we take this piece of foam on? Well, it was probabilistic risk assessment. I wrote a paper at the AIAA of how worthless this is, right? And how we use PRA. All those that are into PRA. They said, don't worry about that piece of foam. There's only a 1 in 10,000 chance that that foam is going to come off and be a problem. Fine. And at the flight readiness reviews, they listen to these people because that gives you a sense of how risky it is. Who wouldn't jump on that vehicle to fly if it was 1 in 10,000? But what do you think? What do you think happened? At about 2 minutes, this is a beautiful picture. We had cameras on our vehicle, Florida coast, beautiful day. This is the external tag, the belly of the vehicle. At about 2 minutes, you're going to see this separate the SRV. That huge piece of foam came off. If it would have hit our wing, it would have been worse than the piece of foam that hit Columbia. And you know what? When those guys went back and calculated the probability of that event, now 1 in 10,000 became 1 in 26. Right? And I don't remember anyone ever going back and showing us how they messed that up so bad. Right? But we still use PRA today. So if Bill Nelson is listening to me at NASA headquarters, we have to stop relying on these people to make predictions about anything, right? That was one near miss. We almost died, right? And so that's where that happened, right? 1 in 10,000. There's something else. There's other large pieces of foam on this external tank called ice frost ramps, which also tend to pop off, right? So I become director of engineering here. I spent about 8 months analyzing the threats to this vehicle before the next flight readiness review for 121. We realized that it's now probably a probability of 1 in 100 that that can cause a problem. We tell the center director, my coach, you know what, Mike, we don't think we should fly. We think there should be 1 in the high risk category in the risk matrix. My coach didn't listen to me. He wouldn't meet with me the day before the flight readiness review. This is him over here. So, and when he was polled, they said, well, what do you think? And he said, I'm center director for Johnson Space Flight Center. We'll go for launch. And I'm sitting in the audience. And I'm just trying to change the culture at NASA in the engineering, like Mike Griffin directed me to do, right? And my team is behind me, squirming in their seats. Charlie Camarda has to get up to the microphone and say, you know what? Charlie Camarda, director of engineering, I don't think that's a good idea. I think we need to take those ice frost ramps off and then fly. You can't see his face looking at me, but I could. You can't see it from this view. Needless to say, I was no longer director of engineering 3 days after this. I was removed and not allowed to be with my team for that launch, even though the astronauts, because not only did I stand up, but Chris Scalise, the chief engineer at headquarters, stood up, said we shouldn't fly. Brian O'Connor, an astronaut in safety and mission assurance, stood up and said we shouldn't fly. Mike Griffin said, I'm the administrator, and I think the risk is acceptable. I'm going to accept the risk. This is the first time in the history of shuttle that we flew a vehicle with 2, not 1, but 2 items in the risk matrix, the likelihood severity matrix, where the incidents are probable to happen, and if they happen, they're catastrophic. Imagine if we did that today with Starliner, or if we're going to do it down the road with the Artemis heat shield, right? They said we're going to fly. We're going to accept the risk, you know? And this was our dissenting opinion, just to prove that engineering was against it. These are the signatures for the certificate of flight readiness. Chief Engineer Chris Scalise, Chief of Safety and Mission Assurance Brian O'Connor. What's crossed out? I concur with proceeding with this mission, and they have a caveat. right? They would not appeal Mike Griffin's decision, and they based it on bogus things like safe haven. Well, there was no such thing as a safe haven. When our power ramp came off, the head of the shuttle program grounded the fleet the minute they knew that large piece of coal come up, because they wouldn't risk a shuttle to come up and rescue us having the same problem. There was no safe haven, but he said that. All right, I digress, right? So, what happens when we launch, right? What do you think happens when we launch? Large piece of probe from the ice cross ramp comes off, right? So now I'm looking at the video because Chris Felice told me I had to go to Mission Control and be with John Murato to watch this video. And we're seeing pieces come off, go above and below the wing leading edge. And I'm looking at John, he's looking at me and saying, I don't know. We go to the mission management meeting the next day. Mission management team, you could have heard a pin drop because now a lot of people were puckering, right? No one knew if this caused a problem, if it hit the wing and it caused a problem after they made this bad decision. The minute the crew called down from space and they did the survey, 8-hour survey, we don't see any damage. The mission managers jumping up and down, high-fiving each other, right? Instead of saying, by the grace of God, we almost lost another crew, they were high-fiving each other. When you read about high reliability organizations, they treat near misses as if they're failures, right? They overemphasize failure. Totally dysfunctional culture, right? The next is in chapter 4 of my book. This was the hardest thing to write because it happened to me personally. Well, for the second time, right? Now I get demoted, working for Ralph Rowe in the illustrious NASA Engineering and Safety Center, right? I thought it was going to be good. I thought there's a chance for them to listen to me. We could make things safer. Little did I know I was being totally silenced, right? Right after my flight, they see an anomaly on a wing leading edge panel on my vehicle, right? And this is a new IR thermography, Bill Winfrey and the guys at Langley developed this. And so we launched, right? And when they took the panel off, they had a tech, picking at that area that you saw the cracks. Large pieces of silicon carbide coating started flaking off. This panel was panel 8R in the hottest region of the vehicle, right? If we would have lost a thumbnail-sized piece of that coating, we would have died, right? Look at how much degradation, how much material loss was under that silicon carbide chip. You can't even see anything that's hanging on. When the people in the leading edge subsystem structural problem resolution team, LESSPRT, the same team that did not raise their hand when a large piece of foam hit that wing leading edge, they said this is not a systemic problem. This is a one of a kind, and we can keep flying. That was their knee-jerk response. So this is the region, right? You have two regions where the heating is very hot, around panels 16, 17, 18, panels 8 to 10. But in this joggle step gap region over here, this could basically protrude into the flow. So the heating is twice as much, aerothermal heating. And oh, by the way, if you lose a chip, now it hits an impingement point, which increases the heating even more. There's no way you could predict how fast that's going to degrade, how fast that's going to grow. And the tools that the LESSPRT were using and claiming to be conservative were not conservative in general, but they could never predict what would happen with this. But yet they said they could. They said they were conservative. Oh, and by the way, we saw chips of coating come off from that exact region 5 years prior to that. When I was a new astronaut, Don Curry presented this. I said, you know what? I got some really smart thermal stress guys back at Langley. that they could help you out with this because this is a thermal stress problem. He said, no, don't worry about it. We got this, right? Little did I know that this was an underlying systemic problem that they found on my wing leading edge. I cut out the numbers here because we've been on time restricted. But when the NESC allowed me and Wally Vaughn to go out there and do a poll test on this material, they were trying to correlate the IR indication as measured in Winfrey's, Bill Winfrey, right? As what the reading was as to how much strength that chip had. You notice the material, the allowable drops off precipitously. It's almost a straight line, right around 0.2. There were 12 panels on 3 different vehicles that we continued to fly for 8 launches that had this kind of damage. All right. As I was trying to get information to prove that this was a problem, and I'm not going to go into the who struck John, but I'm going to show you a chart later. I was reaching for people to help give me information that I could show to Ralph Rowe that this is a serious problem. His illustrious NESC, right? Because they weren't believing me. One of the persons was Kevin McClan. He worked at JSC. He was a safety guy. He got me this legacy data, from shuttles, right? And I started looking at this historical data, and I noticed that the panels in the highly heated regions that had a large number of flights all had these indications of serious damage, right? And all in critical areas. This is a no-brainer. I had to work for 8 months to a year proving to the LESS-PRT and at these flight readiness reviews, finding the same people in my own organization that were trying to silence me. I was taken off email lists. People were told not to send me information. This was the safety organization, right? We were supposed to be looking for problems. Instead, they didn't have time because they were trying to work with the program to provide flight rationale. So when we were told that we changed the culture, and this is a learning organization, and we have a an independent technical authority, never once stood up at that FRR and told the people at the LESS-PRT they're not telling the truth, their tools are not conservative, never once spoke up. And so I don't want to go into the who struck John from when I found the anomaly, but you saw right before STS 117, the NESC agreed with me. You know what? We're not safe to fly, right? Not sufficient flight rationale. 3 days, Ralph holds a separate meeting, just the NESC, closed door meeting. 3 days later, their decision changed. They continued to fly. And so I was watching this happen. I was watching my crewmates, my friends fly with this damage while I was fighting my own organization, right? Got so bad, I had to write a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act, to try to get data, right? You could read this in the book, but it was the toughest part for me to write because I get very upset. My whole attitude changes, as you can tell. But the final straw came. Ralph called me up and said, you know what? Just got a call from the Inspector General. Someone said that they heard that you threw a punch at Mike Gordon, the leader of the LESS-PRT, and missed. And I said, you know what, Ralph? Either you call me back, or you call him up right away and change this by close of business today, or I'm going to go to the New York Times. And I hung up the phone. 20 minutes later, his boss from headquarters calls me up, tells me the same thing. Only I was not as nice to him. And I told him, you know what? I've had it. You're trying to mess with my reputation, my good name. And I used some words that I don't want to use here in this room, but I told him 10 minutes exactly how I felt. And if he didn't change it, I was going to the, well, they immediately called me back and said, you know, it was a mistake. I really didn't do that. They talked to my daughter and I didn't do that. I said, well, no kidding, right? So we flew 8 flights. It took 8 years and a lot of scars. This is not a healthy culture. And when people tell me the culture changed, it takes a lot to change the culture. So what did I do? I put together a team of people. I didn't quit. I still stayed and worked at the language, worked with Bob Moses, Steve Scotty, and other people. A team of people, Jana Taylor from Finland, one of the best learning experience platforms, Peter Morales, CIO, Frank Sissio, Mike Ritchie from Boeing, the chief learning officer. And we were trying to see what can we do to transform an organization. Me and Mike worked with teams of students, him with his Aeropace program at Boeing, and me with my Epic Challenge program. And we looked at how teams of students solve problems, right? We created a learning experience platform, a collaborative platform for the students to use so we can watch them, see how they communicate, see how they learn, see how they make decisions. And we did this, right? And we looked at this network of teams and we looked at this communication and we started studying it. We started studying patterns. And what we learned was that by using very simple techniques like Sandy Petlin recommends in social physics and the new theory of teams, you just look at a couple of parameters like energy, engagement, and exploration. Energy, how many posts are they doing? How many conversations are they having? What types of conversations? Engagement, are they all communicating with each other equally? So it's equally distributed, the energy. And exploration is, if that team doesn't understand something, will they go outside the team and look for an expert to help them out, right? And with that very simple analysis, we were able to pick the team that when it came time, at the end of this 2-semester capstone program, it's a design, build, fly program, one of the best capstone programs. And Boeing had an amazing program led by Mike to do this. We picked that team to be the most successful team, and they blew the other teams away. They basically came up with a VTOL airplane that their advisors said they should never do it because it'll never work, it'll never be. And they won the competition. The other thing we were able to tell was we could tell a little bit about whether or not the team was psychologically safe, because one professor was very pushy and wanted to be on every one of the channels the students had. And so what the students do, they immediately form a student-only channel, a private channel that he couldn't see, because obviously they didn't trust him. So there's an awful lot you can get out of that information. And now with artificial intelligence and machine learning, this is the way to go. Little Charlie Camarda should be getting fired or getting beat up when they raise their hand at meetings because it's psychologically unsafe. Let's let computers and computer agents, chatbots, basically call out the dysfunction, whether it's technical or whether it's cultural. And so the end of the book, I list all the people at Langley, Ames, and Glenn that helped us return to flight. So do you think we have a learning organization? Right now, I'm telling you right now, we don't. Because people at NASA headquarters were downplaying the seriousness of this Artemis heat shield. They're trying to do the right thing, but they don't have the mojo to do it. And they won't listen to me. And we're going to see whether they risk the next crew on this mission. You're listening, Bill Nelson? Anybody have any questions? If you know in your bones what we did as research, is that you're watching what's happening and you're thinking about how to solve this problem. You know, after this book is all over, I really would like to start groups to figure out how do we convince somebody above NASA in the executive branch that NASA needs a major overhaul. Anyway, any questions? Yeah. Come on over here.
So Recently with Starliner, a lot of delays in actually launching, then launch
And then all the problems.
And Boeing said, we had to bring the astronauts back. And NASA said,
Yeah.
So do you think that's showing learning, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. You know, the real test is whether they do it with their own vehicle, NASA, because Starliner wasn't a Boeing problem only, right? The reason why those jets are failing is because we didn't have the right team to understand that critical failure mechanism, because those are the same RCS jets that we use on shuttle, and the people at shuttle in the shuttle program were never able to solve that problem for 30 years with those seals. The other thing that NASA has to own is we allowed that vehicle to fly with a known helium leak, right? And so I totally think Boeing missed an opportunity. The new CEO would have sent a message to the people in his organization. There's a new sheriff in charge, and we're going to do things the right way. We're going to look at the technical aspects of it. If we don't understand this problem technically, we're not going to risk the crew. It's not a matter of money. It's not a matter of schedule. He didn't do that. So whether or not Boeing has the right leadership to change their culture, and I know there's some Boeing folks listening, remains to be seen. But I'm a little wishy-washy sometimes on my answer. Okay.
Please come to the table and
Yeah.
thank you.
What do you think of the Space A's organization?
You know, what do I think of SpaceX organization? And I don't have the inside. I know a lot about Boeing, and so that caught me by surprise, those 737 MAXs, because Boeing to me was an unbelievable company. So that caught me by surprise. I think SpaceX is, somebody asked me a question when I was at an economist a conference in Berkeley, and some young kid in the audience said, "Why isn't NASA like SpaceX?" And I looked at him from the panel and said, "You young punk, NASA was SpaceX. That's how we used to do things." If you watch that Polaris launch, and I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning, believe it or not, but if you watch that and you go online and you look at how they're training astronauts, the science that they're doing, the new spacesuits they developed, how when they test things, they fail, they fix the way Steve Scotty, the way we were testing things when we were trying to get solutions to these problems. It looks like he's doing everything right, but I'm not sure that he really understands the importance of research and having a research arm in his organization. And so I can't say for sure everything is going to be, but it sure looks like they're doing something right. When I saw lots of panels flying off, the ceramic panels flying off of that Starship, and then he launched couple of months after that, I said, "Oh, there are going to be more panels coming off. That's no way they can solve that problem." It didn't happen. So I'm very impressed. I don't know if he's got a high performance organization yet, but it sure looks like it. Elon, if you're online, I'd love to come look at your organization. Anyway, anybody else?
One of the things that when the new Boeing president came in from Raytheon, the president, rather than resigning, went to the board of directors, and which made me wonder what is he going to interfere? You know what I mean? He's in the board of directors now. The old president is that set up a mechanism where he interferes with the new guy coming in trying to do the right things.
It's just like when I thought I was going to be able to accomplish something as director of engineering, but Mike Griffin threw me in the ring with both hands tied behind my back. I don't know the politics of how that's going to work out. But somebody needs to realize it at the very top, because the only way you're going to change the culture is from a very strong understanding that this crap is really important. Those left-brain engineers and those financial guys need to understand that behavioral science and sociology are real sciences, and have this. And unless they have that very strong from the top down, you're never going to be able to change the culture. That's what do I know? That's my 2 cents. I don't, it's very difficult. Any other questions?
We have time for about one or two questions. I did a chat online and don't see anybody, nobody's asked a question on.
How about my good friend Homer Hickam? Is he still online? Hickam's still online?
I am, Charlie.
All right, Homer. Homer
Excellent-
Hickam, my good
excellent
friend. He was
presentation.
a rocket boy before me in Colwood, West Virginia, when little Charlie Camarda was launching rockets out of his backyard in Queens.
And we both managed to not blow ourselves up, amazingly enough.
And I didn't blow myself up either, Homer, but I came close a couple of times.
Charlie, all I can say is excellent presentation, and I'm on your team. And
Thank you.
we saw close hand what occurred in Challenger, and I knew most of that crew, and we needed somebody like you to stand up for the crews and for all the folks who worked on the shuttle at that time. And now we've moved into a new era, and we're carrying along a lot of the same problems. So thank you very much for getting out there and willing to put your own reputation online. We all appreciate it.
Thank you, Homer. And Homer was gracious enough to write the foreword to my book. So how about that? Having a world famous, world renowned author, multiple books, an unbelievable engineer. He used to teach astronauts how to operate their payloads in space. So he knows a little bit about the astronaut culture also. Thank you, Homer.
You're welcome, Charlie. I took that job training astronauts because I figured it would be a very easy job since astronauts already know everything, right?
Most of them do, Homer, right?
They do, actually. You're right.
Yeah. Thank you, Homer.
All right, thank you. How about a round of applause for Charlie? Thank you to our LLA speakers. We present to you our LA Langley Alumni Association. There you go.
Yeah, I do drink a little coffee.
I think you do drink a little coffee, yes. Good talk, good talk. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for
coming.
having me,
I'm
Kat.
glad you were
Thank you, Ola.
Thank you, Charlie, and let us know how we can get your book.
The book, you can pre-order the book now on Amazon, but it will be out probably mid-November.
Great job. We appreciate it.